Back in preseason 11, Riot introduced the item rework update that saw many items get small-scale reworks, some new items added, and some old items removed. Most of these changes were alright given the intention from Riot, but there was one notable outlier to this fact, which was Rod of Ages. Rod of Ages was initially meant to be reworked into Riftmaker, and for the most part, Riftmaker did a pretty good job. It fulfilled that AP fighter need for most champions and simply just did what Rod of Ages did, but better. But there was one major difference between these items that was the nail in the coffin for a select group of champions, which was the removal of mana. To most, this change was really weird and quite frustrating. For champions like Ryze and Cassiopeia, the lack of mana meant they couldn't build it without instantly running out of mana in a fight, and Everfrost didn't have the important fighter aspects that those champions were looking for. It was like Riot kind of just forgot about them and then just ignored their cries, leaving them in their little gimp closet for deformed children like an abusive parent in the 1900s, out of sight and out of mind. And while I do think Riot definitely could have handled the situation much better, it's also kind of understandable given their experience, as it falls under a much larger issue, which is ability power. The problem with ability power is that unlike its counterpart, it has no way to differentiate the classes. The way AD does it is through the fact that everyone needs to start with a base AD value for basic attacks, which lets the stat be broken into base, bonus, and total. From there, Riot can give fighters more base AD, since they will need to be building more defensive focused items, while giving assassins bonus AD and keeping their base AD values relatively low, since they will need as much AD as they can get for the lowest time to kill as possible. This means that items meant for fighters can feature base AD scalings, dissuading assassins, while making assassin items scale with bonus AD, dissuading fighters. But when we look back at AP now, we see that there is no base value, meaning that other than very specific and restrictive passives, which often don't even work, Riot can't stop mages and assassins from poaching the fighter items that they try to make, which would create bounce nightmares due to those items not being intended for them. So then what was Riot's solution to this problem? To essentially just remove mana from the game. And I know what you're probably thinking, yep, that sounds about right for Riot, but I think I can actually understand where they were coming from here. If we're assuming that Riot didn't actually know that ability power itself was the issue, and just saw some sort of pattern between those champions, or maybe some sort of correlation in the data, it isn't really that far off the mark to think that they could just make mana the mage stat and try to use that to differentiate the classes. This is because many AP fighters are using primarily basic attacks, with passives that cost no mana, many don't even have mana to begin with, and AP assassins as a whole don't need mana because their entire design is based around killing enemies in as few hits as possible, which leaves only mages and the aforementioned CDR fighters needing much mana. And just as a side note here, but one that I think is important to mention, mana is also a universal tool for the game that adds a lot of skill expression and depth through resource management. So trying to make it a mage-only stat not only didn't even really fix the actual issue, but also heavily pushed the game into a more brain-dead ability spam meta, where people just spam abilities to poke and shove waves, because mana isn't really a factor anymore. But either way, this is where the second issue comes in, which is another part of the core ability power issue, champion design. Essentially, because Riot can never actually support the AP fighter class without game-breaking poaching issues, they could never really actually release a real AP fighter unless they didn't have mana, hence where that idea came from. This means that their attempts like Kayle, Teemo, and Heimerdinger ended up just being these weird messed up monsters that didn't follow the fundamental balance of the game and ended up just breaking it. This is why these champions are even ranged in the first place, because since they ended up just one-shotting enemies with mage items anyway, their initial design of sustained damage-based fighter didn't make sense, and it was just easier to make them balance as a ranged champion, where if they got dove onto, then their weakness could be their fragility. And this is also why, if we were to give these champions high defensiveness and support AP fighters by doing something like adding base AP without addressing the actual champion design issue, it would just create a bunch of its own issues, with champions like Swain and Ryze absolutely dominating the game due to their balance-breaking designs. And this is why I said it's kind of understandable how they could not put mana on Riftmaker, because if they did, it would easily be poached by mages and abused on them. We even saw this with Everfrost, that even just the small amount of defensiveness it gave through a bit of health in the root, that it was enough to be abused by mages, using it way better than actual AP fighters ever could. And this is where we get into the reintroduction of Rod of Ages and the issues it brings with it. If it weren't for Riot not understanding that the old Rod of Ages scaling mechanic simply just doesn't work in the new Mythic system because you aren't actively choosing your Mythic, but you're being forced to build it because it's the only option, Rod of Ages would be a major balance issue terrorizing the game. It's pretty much only being kept in check by the fact that the game is in such a terrible state of snowballing and early power that if Riot were to do something like make its early stronger, we would see a massive influx of very tanky ranged champions become the instant meta and make the game unplayable for entire classes of champions. So then what could Riot actually do? Well, apart from addressing the actual ability power issue, a more immediate band-aid solution could be to make the item less appealing to ranged champions. For example, something like making Eternity ramp up with each proc up to a cap of like 15 or something similar to Conqueror, meaning that champions like Lux who want to play safe are dissuaded because more of its power is tied to getting into the action, dealing damage and getting hit. And then from there, since AP fighters technically have 2 viable items now, Riot can maybe try to start untying some of the deep-rooted issues the game has, like its champion design, that was previously being stunted by now partially solved problems.